On November 25, 2003, a quiet neighborhood in Whitehouse, Texas, became the scene of a chilling family tragedy. At the center of it was 42-year-old Tracy Lane Beatty, a man freshly released from prison, struggling to rebuild his life, and living once again under the same roof as the woman who raised him, his mother, Carolyn Ruth Click. What began as another heated argument between mother and son would soon spiral into one of the most shocking crimes East Texas had ever seen. In a moment of rage, Beatty strangled his 62-year-old mother, the same woman who had given him shelter when no one else would, and buried her body in a shallow grave behind her home. Then he locked the doors, took her car, and disappeared. When police finally uncovered the truth, the horror of what they found stunned even the most seasoned investigators. The courts would later convict Beatty of capital murder and sentence him to death, citing a violent past and a cold attempt to cover up the crime. After nearly 2 decades on death row, his final day would come on November 9, 2022, inside the Huntsville Unit, where he would speak his last words before the needle was inserted. What drives a man to destroy the one person who gave him life? To find that answer, we need to trace the path of pain that led from a mother's forgiveness to her final breath. Tracy Lane Beatty was born in 1961, deep in the heart of East Texas, a place where hard work was expected but stability was rare. From a young age, life taught him more about survival than success. He grew up in a home shadowed by poverty, conflict, and a broken family structure that left deep scars. Teachers remembered a boy who was restless, angry, and quick to lash out, a pattern that would follow him for the rest of his life. By his teenage years, Tracy had already started drifting, taking odd labor jobs and living wherever he could find a roof. He was a laborer by trade but a drifter by heart, constantly moving between jobs, towns, and trouble. As he got older, his temper and poor choices led him down a darker path, one filled with alcohol, petty theft, and violence. His criminal record began to take shape early. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison from Dallas County for the crime of injury to a child. After serving his time, he was released on mandatory supervision, a second chance to rebuild his life, but it wouldn't last long. He was soon back behind bars with a new conviction, a 15-year sentence for theft, again from Dallas County. Each release brought promises of reform, yet each return told the same story, a man caught in a cycle he couldn't escape. By his early 40s, Tracy Beatty had spent nearly 2 decades bouncing between freedom and confinement, parole and prison cells. He was hardened by the system, shaped by isolation, and burdened by a growing sense of failure. Those who knew him said he could be charming when sober, but unpredictable when angry, a man haunted by his own volatility. Behind that tough exterior was someone struggling with deep emotional instability and untreated mental health issues, slowly boiling beneath the surface. As the years passed, his life became a revolving door of bad decisions, broken relationships, and mounting resentment. In late 2003, after serving his latest prison sentence, Tracy Beatty walked out of the Texas prison gates once again, a free man on paper but far from free inside. Released on parole, he returned to the only place that would still take him in, his mother's small home in Whitehouse, Texas, a quiet town on the outskirts of Tyler where life moved slowly and everyone knew everyone. For most people, Whitehouse was a place of comfort and community. But for Tracy and his mother, Carolyn Ruth Click, that modest house on the corner would soon become a battlefield of old wounds, buried resentment, and broken promises. Carolyn, a 62-year-old widow, was known around town as a kind, cautious woman, gentle but strong-willed. Friends described her as the sort who always had a smile for the mailman and fresh flowers growing by her porch. She loved her garden, her church, and lending a hand whenever someone in the neighborhood needed help. But those who knew her well also knew that her biggest struggle wasn't outside her home. It was living under her own roof. Her relationship with her son, Tracy, had always been complicated, a volatile mix of love, fear, and deep disappointment. At first, things seemed calm. Neighbors saw mother and son running errands together, working in the yard, even sharing meals. But it didn't take long for the old patterns to resurface. Tracy's drinking returned, his temper flared, and every minor disagreement became a shouting match. Neighbors would later tell police they often heard loud arguments, the kind that made you stop what you were doing and listen. One neighbor recalled, "You could hear them fighting almost every other night, yelling, cursing, doors slamming. Sometimes the police would come. Sometimes she just took him back in." Behind those closed doors, Carolyn was trying to hold on to hope, hoping her son would change, that the man who had spent half his life behind bars could finally turn things around. But to those who watched from across the street, the tension between them was obvious. Each argument chipped away at the fragile peace between them, until all that was left was fear and frustration. What began as an attempt at reconciliation was slowly turning into something much darker, a dangerous reunion that neither of them would survive. It was the evening of November 25, 2003, just 2 days before National Thanksgiving, when the fragile peace inside Carolyn Click's small Whitehouse home finally shattered. The arguments between mother and son had been getting louder, more heated, and more desperate with each passing day. That night, according to police reports and court testimony, the tension reached its breaking point. The fight reportedly began over money and control. Carolyn had grown tired of her son's drinking, his temper, and his inability to hold a steady job. She wanted him out of the house. Tracy Beatty, freshly out on parole, saw her threat as yet another rejection, another reminder that he had nowhere else to go. Words turned to shouting, shouting turned to rage, and in a split second something inside him snapped. In a moment of uncontrollable fury, Tracy Beatty strangled his 62-year-old mother in her bedroom, ending her life instantly. Investigators would later describe the scene as one of heartbreaking violence. A son's hands taking the life of the woman who had given him everything she could. For a while Beatty just sat there staring at what he had done. And then, coldly and methodically, he began to cover his tracks. According to official court records, Beatty wrapped Carolyn's body in a blanket, dragged her out through the back door, and buried her in a shallow grave just a few feet from the back porch, the same porch where she used to sit and tend to her plants. The ground was soft, recently watered from the garden hose she'd used that morning. He covered the grave with soil and debris, locked up the house, and left as if nothing had happened. A court document later summarized the act in chilling simplicity. He buried his mother in the backyard, then locked the house and took her car and credit cards. In the days that followed, Beatty drove his mother's vehicle around town, using her bank card for cash withdrawals and telling people that she was fine, that she had gone away for a while. But inside that small Whitehouse home, buried beneath the dirt and the silence, lay the grim evidence of his crime. A mother betrayed and left to rest in the garden she once loved. The town of Whitehouse had no idea what had just taken place behind those walls. But soon, the smell of decay, the whispers of suspicion, and one neighbor's uneasy feeling would lead investigators to uncover the truth and expose one of the most shocking crimes East Texas had ever seen. As the days turned into weeks after Thanksgiving 2003, the quiet neighborhood of Shelley Street in Whitehouse, Texas, began to sense that something was terribly wrong. Carolyn Click, a woman known for her warm smile and friendly chats over the fence, had vanished. Her porch light stayed off, her mailbox overflowed, and her phone rang unanswered. Friends and neighbors, who were used to seeing her tending to her garden or chatting on her porch, grew increasingly uneasy. It was around mid-December when concerned neighbors finally called the police, reporting that Carolyn hadn't been seen for weeks. Officers from the Tyler Police Department arrived to conduct a welfare check, expecting perhaps an illness or a sudden trip, but what they found was far more disturbing. When investigators entered the small, single-story home, they were immediately hit with the pungent odor of decay. The house was locked, eerily still, and strangely tidy, almost as if someone had tried to erase any trace of what had happened inside. But nature has a way of revealing secrets, and the scent told them everything they needed to know. Something or someone was dead. The search quickly moved to the backyard, where officers noticed freshly disturbed soil near the back porch, the same place Carolyn often sat during warm evenings. The ground appeared uneven, and patches of it were covered with leaves and debris. As detectives began digging, the realization hit. This was not a missing persons case anymore. It was a homicide. Moments later, the grim discovery was made. Wrapped in a blanket, partially decomposed, and buried in a shallow grave, lay the body of Carolyn Click. Her hands were still clenched, her face partially obscured by dirt and fabric. Even seasoned investigators were shaken by the scene. A mother buried by her own son, mere steps from the home she had shared with him. The investigation shifted into high gear. Detectives began piecing together a timeline of events, interviewing neighbors and checking financial activity. It didn't take long to uncover something suspicious. Carolyn's ATM card and car were being used regularly in nearby towns. Surveillance footage showed a man fitting the description of her son, Tracy Beatty, withdrawing cash. Within days, a statewide alert was issued for Carolyn's missing vehicle, a silver Pontiac Grand AM. On December 19, 2003, officers in Smith County spotted the car and pulled it over. Behind the wheel was Tracy Beatty, calm but visibly nervous. When questioned, he claimed his mother was fine and staying with a friend, but his story quickly unraveled under pressure. Inside the vehicle, Police found Carolyn's identification cards, ATM receipts, and personal belongings, items that made it clear Beatty had been living off his mother's assets since her disappearance. He was taken into custody and brought to the Smith County Jail for questioning. According to court transcripts, detectives spent hours in the interrogation room with Beatty, pressing him for answers as the evidence mounted against him. Finally, the facade cracked. After long hours of silence, tears, and conflicting statements, he broke down. In his own words, he admitted what investigators already suspected. He confessed after hours of questioning, admitting to killing his mother and burying her body. Beatty told detectives that an argument had gotten out of hand, that he didn't mean to do it, and that he had buried her in the backyard because he panicked. But by then his remorse came too late. The evidence was overwhelming: the grave, the car, the stolen money, the lies. The small Texas town that had once known Carolyn as a kind, gentle woman now reeled in disbelief. A mother who had opened her home to her troubled son had been betrayed in the most unimaginable way. As news of the arrest spread, shock turned to sorrow and sorrow to outrage. For the detectives who had worked the case, justice was only beginning. But for Carolyn Click, her story had already come to its tragic end. One that began with love, ended with betrayal, and would soon lead to a murder trial that captured the attention of all of Texas. The courtroom in Smith County, Texas, was packed when the trial of Tracy Lane Beatty began. The air was thick with tension. Reporters filled the gallery, neighbors whispered among themselves, and the jury watched closely as the grim details of a mother's final moments unfolded before them. The district attorney's office had wasted no time. Beatty was charged with capital murder, a charge reserved for the most severe cases. In this instance, murder committed during the course of a burglary. Prosecutors alleged that Beatty not only killed his mother, Carolyn Click, but did so to steal her possessions and gain access to her bank accounts. It wasn't just a family dispute gone wrong. It was, in their words, a deliberate act of greed and cruelty. During the trial, prosecutors meticulously laid out the evidence. They showed how Beatty had strangled his mother, buried her in the backyard, locked the house, and then taken her car and ATM card. They presented financial records, surveillance footage, and testimony from neighbors who had heard the violent arguments that often echoed from the Click home. One of the prosecutors told the jury, "This was not an accident. This was cold, calculated, and heartless." They also introduced Beatty's criminal past, his prior convictions for injury to a child and theft, along with a long history of violent and erratic behavior. These prior offenses were used as aggravating factors, painting a portrait of a man who had spent much of his life defying the law and hurting those around him. But the defense team offered a very different story. They claimed Beatty suffered from severe mental illness and was a product of lifelong abuse, neglect, and psychological trauma. His attorneys argued that he had grown up in a cycle of violence, that his actions, while horrific, stemmed from deep-seated emotional damage and untreated mental health conditions. They asked the jury for mercy, insisting that his crime, though tragic, was born from pain rather than pure evil. Psychiatrists were brought in to testify about Beatty's unstable mind, describing him as a man with borderline personality traits and chronic depression. But the prosecution countered sharply, saying mental illness could not erase the brutality of what he had done. They reminded the jury that Carolyn Click had opened her home to her son out of love, and for that act of kindness she was killed and buried like a discarded object. The courtroom fell silent as the jury retired to deliberate. For hours, the fate of Tracy Beatty hung in the balance, between life imprisonment and death. When the jury returned, their decision was swift and final. The verdict: guilty of capital murder. Beatty sat motionless as the words were read aloud. No tears. No visible reaction. Some in the courtroom described the moment as chilling, a man facing his own mortality yet showing no remorse. The sentence: death by lethal injection. Carolyn's friends wept quietly in the back row. One of them whispered, "She didn't deserve this." In the years that followed, Beatty's legal team appealed the conviction multiple times, arguing procedural errors and mental incompetence. But the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the verdict, ruling that the evidence against him was overwhelming and that his sentence was just. A son condemned for murdering the woman who gave him life, a story as tragic as it is haunting. Inside the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, the place where the state's most condemned men await their fate, Tracy Beatty began what would become nearly 2 decades of existence in near total isolation. His world was reduced to a 6 by 10-foot concrete cell, a steel bunk bolted to the wall, and a narrow slit of a window that let in barely a trace of sunlight. Every day followed the same rhythm: wake up at dawn to the clang of steel doors, eat meals pushed through a slot, exercise alone in a caged yard, then return to silence. He had no cellmate, no communal recreation, and almost no human touch. Only the sound of guards' footsteps in the corridor, the distant echo of other inmates shouting through concrete, and the endless tick of time. Within those walls, time moved differently. Days blurred into months, months into years. For some, it was unbearable. For Beatty, it was a slow descent into the psychological toll that long-term isolation brings. According to reports, he became withdrawn, pacing endlessly, talking to himself, and growing increasingly detached from reality. His attorneys argued throughout his appeals that he suffered from severe mental illness, including depression, paranoia, and cognitive decline, making him unfit for execution. They claimed his deteriorating mental state had left him incapable of understanding his punishment, a key requirement under U.S. law. But the Texas courts disagreed. Judges reviewed his medical records, psychiatric evaluations, and legal motions, ultimately concluding that Beatty was competent to face execution. In their view, he understood both the crime he committed and the reason for his sentence. The legal battle raged for years, bouncing between state and federal courts, each ruling bringing him one step closer to the inevitable. During this time, Beatty's behavior became a subject of controversy. Some guards described him as volatile, quick-tempered, and argumentative. Others said he had grown quiet and reflective, occasionally reading the Bible or writing notes that few ever saw. The line between sanity and despair blurred, a man trapped in the waiting room of death, with nothing left but the echo of his own thoughts. Then, in 2022, after years of back-and-forth litigation, his final appeal was denied. News outlets across Texas reported that the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals had rejected his motion, clearing the path for his execution to proceed. It was the evening of November 9, 2022, when the quiet town of Huntsville, Texas, once again became the center of the nation's attention. Outside the red-bricked walls of the Huntsville Unit, known simply as the Walls, news cameras were set up under the dim glow of streetlights. Reporters spoke in hushed tones, their breath visible in the cool night air. Behind those walls, after 19 years on death row, 61-year-old Tracy Lane Beatty was taking his final walk. At approximately 6 p.m., prison staff escorted Beatty from the holding cell to the Texas death chamber, a short, sterile room with pale green walls and a single gurney at its center. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as tense but calm. The air was heavy with finality. Beatty, wearing a white prison uniform, was strapped down, his arms secured, IV lines inserted. By Texas law, special last meals are no longer allowed, a policy that's been in effect since 2011. Instead, Beatty received his final meal from the regular prison menu, a simple dinner that went unrecorded. There were no indulgences, no final requests, only the quiet acceptance of what was to come. As the witnesses took their seats behind the glass partition, Beatty turned his head slightly toward the observation window. Among those watching were members of his family and friends who had stood by him for years, as well as representatives of the state of Texas. When asked for his last words, Beatty spoke softly but clearly. His voice, calm and composed, carried through the chamber as he said, "I just want to thank my friends and family for supporting me and loving me. I want to thank the Lord Jesus Christ for everything He has done for me." He paused for a moment, then closed his eyes. At 6:36 p.m., the lethal dose of pentobarbital began to flow through the IV lines. Within seconds, his breathing slowed. His chest rose once, then fell. Prison officials checked for a pulse. At 6:39 p.m., Tracy Beatty was pronounced dead, his nearly two-decade journey through the Texas justice system finally at its end. Outside the prison walls, a small candlelight vigil had gathered, friends of Carolyn Ruth Click, the woman whose life had been taken 19 years earlier. They stood quietly, candles flickering in the dark, remembering the mother, the neighbor, the friend she once was. For them, this was not about vengeance, it was about closure. As the Huntsville Unit lights dimmed and the last of the news crews packed up, the prison gates closed once again, marking the end of a story that began in anger and ended in silence. A son and a mother, bound by blood, torn apart by violence, their story now etched forever into the history of Texas death row. The story of Tracy Beatty and Carolyn Ruth Click is more than just another entry in Texas' long history of capital punishment. It's a chilling reminder of how rage, resentment, and unresolved pain can destroy the very bonds meant to hold us together. A mother's love met with her son's anger, a life lost and another condemned. As the echoes of this tragedy fade from the prison walls, one question remains: could it have been prevented? What do you think? Should decades on death row bring redemption, or does justice demand its final act? Share your thoughts below, and don't just scroll past. Your voice matters in this ongoing conversation about crime, punishment, and forgiveness in America.